Nice to be with you.
So Trevor, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to meet Philippe, make this film?
Sure.
Let's start from the beginning.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was an attendee at the Melbourne Film Festival for many, many years when I lived in Melbourne, which is a southern city in Australia. And they have a very good film festival, the Melbourne International Film Festival, for which Monsieur Mayonnaise was actually made. And when I was a teenager, I used to go and I saw a couple of films by Philippe Mora, who then was a documentary filmmaker. He made a film called Swastika in 1973, and then he made another documentary called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime in 1975. Philippe comes from a well-known Melbourne arts family. His mother, as you see in the film, is a well-known painter. So I knew of the family and I knew of Philippe's reputation as a filmmaker. So one day I was on Facebook and I saw, oh, there's Philippe Mora on Facebook. So we instantly became friends. And then I discovered more about Philippe himself, that not only was he a filmmaker and he'd gone on to have a career in Hollywood, I'd say a minor career in Hollywood, but nevertheless a Hollywood career. And I also discovered that he was a cartoonist and a painter, and that when he was about 17 or 18, he went to London when London was, you know, in the swinging 60s. And he established himself there as a painter and exhibited his work. Now, I knew nothing of that. I only knew of his mother as a painter and him as a filmmaker. So I became more and more intrigued by Philippe, and I was following his Facebook posts, and I discovered that we had very similar interests about art, filmmaking, history, the Second World War, Nazism, and the Holocaust. So I said to him one day, hey, Philippe, I've been following your family story, because he was posting stories about his family on his Facebook page and illustrating some of these stories with comic book kind of drawings like you see in the film. So I sent him a message one day saying, look, Philippe, I'm a filmmaker. Here's a few films that I've made. Check them out. Are you interested in collaborating on a film? And he said, yeah, let's talk. So I have Facebook to thank for really the beginnings of Monsieur Mayonnaise and actually meeting Philippe for the first time. But as I said, I was aware of his family in Melbourne, and his mum and dad used to run several art galleries. I used to go to the art galleries. I would regularly see his father, Georges, when I went to the art gallery. I had friends who exhibited in the Mora Art Gallery. So, you know, I was sort of well connected in a way, but Philippe was living in Los Angeles in West Hollywood, and I didn't know of him apart from his films and then Facebook. So that's how it all started. But if you want to leap back further in terms of my interest in the subject matter, my father was a veteran of the Second World War, and I used to watch a lot of documentaries when I was a young teenager. I'm talking about 13 or 14, with my father about the war. There was an epic series, a BBC series called The History of the Second World War, which was shown on Australian TV. And I remember it was like 26 episodes, 26 hours of TV running through the whole history of the Second World War. So I became very interested in the subject matter of the Second World War through that series and through my father's experience in what was in Palestine during the war. So those two things sort of started in me an interest in both documentary, factual television, and a strong interest in current affairs TV. So at an early age, I was watching a lot of current affairs from America, from Australia, about, you know, civil rights movements in America. I still follow what's going on now with Trump avidly. And so I had, from a young age, I had this real interest in documentary and history. Then I went to art school. I also had a Jewish girlfriend. Her parents were Holocaust survivors who lived in Melbourne. Her mother was a wonderful woman who had escaped from Berlin, a very enlightened woman for the time. So my girlfriend and her parents and that whole sort of family experience had a big impact on me. But I had an interest in the Holocaust from my father's experience of the war and through, as I said, following this documentary series. I just had this interest in what had happened to the Jews of Europe. I also went to school in a Jewish area where I had lots of Jewish friends. So it was, again, whose parents were all Holocaust survivors. So it's sort of like being non-Jewish, I was just sort of steeped in a particular element of Melbourne's multicultural community, which happened to be Jewish, and it all sort of rubbed off in a funny kind of way.
We have a habit of doing that. So you said you went to art school. Did you go to art school specifically for filmmaking?
No, I went to study printmaking and painting, but I actually did some filmmaking while I was at art school. I went to a very liberal art school at the time where you could actually change disciplines very easily. And so I did actually make some films while I was at art school. And then I essentially worked as a photographer, like a documentary photographer, for about maybe about 8 years. And then after that, my passion for filmmaking kicked in. I made my first documentary it was finished in 1985. And from then on, it was very successful. And from then on, I've just worked continuously as a filmmaker. And I have to say, it's a tough business. It's not easy, but I've been relatively lucky, and I've had some successes nationally in Australia, but also internationally. So, yeah.
What's the overall, how do Australians feel about, the Jews that came from Europe during the war or after the war and settled in Australia? I mean, there's a lot of families. We've read some books. We're interviewing Sue Goldfish next week.
Yep.
So her family's there as well. So
yep.
It
It does depend very much on which city you live in. The biggest Jewish population is in Melbourne. I think historically Jews were more attracted to Melbourne going back to the 19th century, and there was a steady inflow of immigrants from Europe to Melbourne from the time of the gold rush in Australia, which was roughly about 1860. But pre-Second World War, there were more refugees coming from Europe up to a certain point where the refugee inflow was stopped. But they tended to go to Melbourne. And so you get there's a lot of Polish Jews in Melbourne. And then after the Second World War, there were Jewish people from Hungary that tended to settle in Sydney. And they are very distinct communities, in my view. The Melbourne community is, I think, much more steeped in cultural traditions. There was a Jewish theatre, there was Jewish press in Melbourne, lots of influential Jewish people in cultural affairs, philanthropy, and you don't find that so much in Sydney. It tends to be a more business-oriented Jewish community in Sydney. And in the other capital cities, you will find very, very small populations of Jewish people. Jews are everywhere, as you know. But the biggest consolidated community is definitely in Melbourne.
We actually, Eileen and I looked at a film called Outback Rabbis, and it's about the Chabad rabbis who go to the Outback. So that was pretty interesting. Right. So I feel like I could be friends with Philippe. He seems like a really fun and energetic guy, and his mom the same. His
Yeah.
brother seems a little calmer than the rest of them, just from the interviews that you did. But
Yeah.
what was it like working with them?
Well, you've picked up some family traits there because William, the other brother, is a bit more like his father. And within the family, that is acknowledged. And William followed in his father's footsteps and has become an art dealer and runs an art gallery. Whereas Philippe is the first child. I think more influenced by his mother than the others. And so he's a much more vibrant and kind of vivacious kind of guy, like his mum, great sense of humour. Working with Philippe was fantastic. As I said, you know, we had so many mutual interests and ideas. It was a very collaborative relationship. We only had one argument in about 2.5 years of working together on the film and spending, I think it was 8 weeks on the road shooting the film. So it was a pretty harmonious time for both of us. And we sparked off each other. A lot of the things that you see in the film were initiated by me. Like, he goes on this journey, but we took him on the journey, really, and we didn't tell him necessarily where he was going or who he was going to meet until the last minute, because we didn't want him getting on the internet and checking out the people he was going to meet and therefore starting to build a relationship with him. And so when you see the scene with the psychiatrist, Henri Parent, in Philly, they hadn't met. They hadn't met. They'd exchanged one email with each other. And unfortunately, Philippe had done a little bit of Googling to sort of find out who the hell this guy was, which I was a little bit disappointed about, because I said, no Googling, please. But nevertheless, he did it. But as you saw, it's a very spontaneous meeting in the film. So a lot of those things were set up by me. The idea of going and painting on location, doing his history comic book art, if you like, you know, in the tradition of history painting, but I wanted it to be on location. So where actually Hitler stood overlooking the Eiffel Tower is the spot that I wanted Philippe to paint. And he wanted to paint the picture he paints, which is Hitler being there. But he could have done it in the studio at home. And I said, no, let's go to Paris and let's do it on location, because it makes it much more interesting and historical. You know, the connection of a comic book artist going to a location to create an image of Hitler about a location that Hitler actually stood in during the occupation of France. Just it sort of resonated in my mind very strongly. So, of course, going to the Brandenburg Gate was important too. So, yeah, the ideas bounced around a lot between us, and some of it was led by me and some of it was led by him. Definitely a lot of his art was discussed. I should do this painting, I should do that painting. And I would say, yeah, why don't you do that painting, but do another one as well. So we sort of bounced around like that quite a lot.
So with regard to the paintings, I was doing a little Googling myself about the film. And there was an article by Jay Weisberg in Variety magazine. And he said, Graham doesn't allow any reference to go unillustrated, which bogs down the documentary with too much distracting footage. But fortunately, the Mora saga is strong enough to withstand the frequent deviations. Why did you choose to combine the footage from the Holocaust, the pictures that Philippe was painting, the live interviews with his family? Sometimes it feels disjointed, but in the end, it's a marvelous film.
Hello, dogs. Well, that's the sort of person, filmmaker that I am. The film had to reflect the kind of zaniness of the Mora family. And you get a touch of that with you get a strong sense of that, I think, with Mirka and with Philippe as well, in terms of their humour. Now, it's a tricky business making a humorous film about such a serious subject like the Holocaust. But Philippe and I had a pact, which we kind of swore in blood, that we were going to make a different film about the Holocaust. Like it or hate it, that's up to audiences to decide. But we decided our aim was not to make yet another film about the Holocaust. It had to be strikingly different. We also had an ambition to reach a new audience about the story of the Holocaust. And that was very much Philippe's aim in making a comic book, that he wanted the story of the Holocaust to resonate through comic book images with younger people. And I completely dug that idea. I thought that was a really neat way to try and reach a new audience. But we very much, because of his sense of humour, because of his family humour, and because of my own sense of humour, we had to do something that reflected all of that. So it had to be funny and it had to be serious. It had to have its moments of gravitas, but also its moments of lightness. The story of putting the identity papers of people into a mayonnaise-laden baguette is a funny enough idea in itself. So if you're going to sort of focus on leading an audience to that story, then you need to be humorous along the way. You can't just land there and think, gee, that's funny, but, you know, I've been bored down with, you know, lots of sort of serious, depressing stuff along the way. So, look, I hope that we've achieved a balance of light and dark and many shades in between in the storytelling. But to answer your question, the film had to be a blancmange in a way. It had to be, you know, have all the various elements to make it up. But the thing that needed to tie it together was a really strong and coherent story. And that's what I think the film does. It can go off in sort of zaniness as long as you, the audience, come back to a sense of, I'm going on a journey with this character and I'm going to find out about his parents along the way as he searches for answers about what happened to them, how they survived the Holocaust, what they did in the occupation of France. So, and I think you go on that journey and you stay put. And as you said, it's a fairly compelling film by the time you get to the end, and you've experienced some funny moments along the way.
Yeah, you know, we showed Jojo Rabbit as part of the JCC Chicago Jewish Film Festival, and I'm pretty sure your film came out before then, but in the same vein, a serious topic, but with some sort of humor behind it. So tell me about how the horror scenes fit into the humor, because that was for me, I don't like horror movies, so that was a little bit off-putting.
I'm not a big fan of horror movies either, and I'm certainly not a big fan of Philippe's horror films. He won't mind me saying that. But I have this theory that his horror films are influenced by his examination and interest in the Holocaust. And as Philippe would say himself, there are many Jewish Hollywood directors who have gone into horror. And now I don't want to get too psychoanalytical about it, but I think you can say that there's a very direct link between the interest of directors in America of a Jewish background and their existential, if you like, interest in horror filmmaking. And Philippe's just one of them. So I was making that direct connection, as his brother says, you know, you have to have a sense of humor if you're a Jew. And
I think that's a really interesting.
The horror films that he makes are deliberately funny, comedic, and that's probably what I don't like about them, because I like a more serious horror film that's really scary and threatening.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting perspective, though, that he sort of took this horror film route to deal with, he's a second generation survivor, and generally, this is a generalization, parents of Holocaust survivors didn't normally talk to their children. It's been the grandchildren, the third generation and the fourth generation great grandchildren, who have started gathering these stories and bringing them to the forefront. So I think it's an interesting perspective that he kind of used horror stories to deal with that that sort of maybe lack of knowledge about what his family had gone through, until he went on this journey with you. So when he was painting in Paris, and a place where Hitler actually stood, did anyone come up to him and say, why are you doing that? Why are you painting that guy? We don't like to revisit this.
That happened in Germany, in Berlin. We were at the Brandenburg Gate, the scene at night time that you see very briefly, and he's painting a portrait of Hitler with the Brandenburg Gate in the background. And there were some pedestrians, passers-by, who came up and said, why are you doing that? And we had to explain to them what we were doing. And they were, I remember one woman being very upset seeing that Hitler was on the streets of Berlin. And we tried our best to explain what it is we were doing, but she still didn't like it. Nowhere else did we have a problem. In Paris, there were people who were interested, and we just explained to them what we were doing, and they let us get on with what we were doing, our filming, and they then left. There was only that one Berlin incident where it was a problem.
So the story about the mayonnaise, because one of the other things I read was that, the film is also very tasty, because, we go to the bakery, and we have several people making mayonnaise. So, I mean, is mayonnaise a huge part of the Mora family's lives? Like, do they slather it on everything? And is it really true that this is what his dad did in the Resistance?
Well, I've only got Philippe's word on that, and I've got, not directly, but again via Philippe, Marcel Marceau's take on it all, because Marcel Marceau was part of this story. So yes, I think that's a good question. Is it really true? I can only answer you the way that I have, that it's part of the sort of Mora family legend that this happened, and that they have it via Marcel Marceau, who is Philippe's godfather. So I have every reason to believe it. And, there are many funny stories about what went on in the Second World War, and things that you would sort of, in the world of subterfuge and resistance, and people working in the shadows, many fun. You've only got to read books about the Resistance, and you find these incredible stories about how people survived and the lucky escapes they had, and the wacky things that happened that allowed them to survive. So I sort of put it in that camp. It could be a tall, exaggerated story with elements of truth about it, but you're never really going to know. Mayonnaise in the Mora family is a very big deal. It was a big part of the restaurants that they opened in Melbourne. Baguettes with servings of mayonnaise, but mayonnaise, it's a fairly French typical speciality, and both their restaurants were French restaurants. So yes, mayonnaise is a big thing in the Mora family. That's not an exaggeration. I think it's important to say that, the food elements are really deliberately there, again, because Philippe grew up in a family that were artists and restaurateurs. So the food had to be a strong part of the story, also because of the mayonnaise, Monsieur Mayonnaise connection. But also, I think the last three films I've made have all had really strong food themes, because I think food is a way we all enjoy eating. We all like to eat. And I think the idea of presenting food on screen is a way, and humour is a way of relaxing audiences into some very serious subjects. So if you're feeling like, gee, that food looks nice, and you're also laughing at the same time, then maybe it's a bit easier to digest some of the sort of atrocity of the film as well. So it's a strategy.
Does Philippe's mom was she educated in art, or she self-taught? And then how did Philippe come to get involved in art?
She had a very brief stint at art school in Paris, but it was very brief. So I would say she's largely self-taught. And the same with Philippe. Philippe, grew up under his mother's wing, so to speak. And I think he just sort of, soaked it all up. And he was drawing from a very early age, as you actually see in the film, and doing some quite accomplished stuff.
Yeah, I noticed that he and his mom have a lot of stuff. I just had to point that out, that they have a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think Philippe has inherited his mother's bowerbird instinct to just gather things and keep them. And when we were filming in her studio apartment, it's a big space, a really huge old warehouse space. And we were literally having to walk sideways down these little aisles that had been created because there were piles of things like books and odds and ends, old prams for, wheeling kids around, dolls, bookcases, you name it. There was just everything everywhere. And the scene in her kitchen, we had to put up lights, and we were sort of struggling to find places to securely put the lights down. It was a nightmare filming there.
But you got to eat mayonnaise after that, because she made mayonnaise.
We got to eat some very nice baguettes with mayonnaise, so yes.
So how long did it take to make the film, and then what was the editing process? And
okay, it was shot over 3 shoots in America, and the trip to Europe included in one of those. It probably took about 3 years, 3.5 years to develop the idea, work out the idea, raise the money. Raising the money took the longest. And then maybe about a year to make it, including the editing. So I think I probably spent about 9 weeks, 10 weeks with Philippe filming. 2 trips to Los Angeles, and then another trip to Los Angeles and going to Europe as well. And some filming that we did with him and his mum in Melbourne, another week or so. So yeah, about 10 weeks all up, and probably about 20 weeks of editing.
It's pretty short for a film, 10 weeks and 20 weeks of editing. It's not a lot.
Yeah. Look, documentaries like this can be made more quickly than that. But, we had a lot of things to work out. There was a lot of travel. There was only myself and director of photography on the crew. So all those more elaborate film noir setups that you see in the film, they were shot by 2 people. Myself as director and recording sound, and my wonderful cinematographer, with a little bit of help from Philippe too. And Philippe's wife, Pamela, who's a makeup artist. So we kind of, we had a small team, but it worked.
We have a question from the audience. When it takes so long to actually go from inception to the screen, what does a filmmaker do to make a living?
Lots
Because
of
we know
different.
that films are not cheap. We pay a lot for rights when we show them.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
do you do something else besides filmmaking?
I work on other people's films. I also do a bit of writing, various sort of income streams to keep me going. But I tend to work on other people's films as well, so that helps to have some paid income. The last 3 films I've made, I've gone without a salary for, like, I'm just finishing one now that's taken 3 years to make. I've earned almost nothing from it, but I'll get a big payout at the end of the film, which doesn't cover 3 years' work, but it'll keep me going for another year or two. So that's the way I tend to structure my work and my finance, and then I earn dribs and drabs by working on other people's films as well. But it's not an easy business, and it's okay for me because I'm sort of like, at the twilight end of my career. It's pretty hard for people starting out though, and facing all the difficulties that you have in raising money and creating interest. But when you get to my age and I've made quite a few films, I've got a reputation, so people can sort of take me seriously. So that helps.
Yeah. If Are Philippe's sons involved in art or in the family business with his brother?
Philippe has 2 sons and a daughter. One of the sons is an actor. The other son is half an actor. So yeah, they're interested in following in mum and dad's footsteps. There's no doubt about that. And Philippe's got another brother who's an actor, worked in a lot of Australian drama, on particularly TV drama. And his other brother, William, as you see in the film, he's an art gallery dealer. So yeah, they're all involved in the arts for sure.
Do the restaurants still exist in Melbourne, or they're?
No, well, the last restaurant that Mirka and Georges opened was called the Talano restaurant. It still exists as a restaurant. It still is a French restaurant, but the Moras have no connection with it whatsoever.
So do you still have a friendship with Philippe beyond having worked on the film? You guys talk?
Yeah. We
I guess
communicate
once
a
you
lot.
become friends with him, you can't give it up because he's so funny.
we still have a lot of Facebook connection, actually. That's basically how we sort of talk to each other, is through Facebook.
It's the time difference makes it hard.
Yeah, and pre-COVID, before, when he was coming to Australia, we would catch up then too. So, but I haven't been back to America since Trump was in power. So I'm kind of I'm waiting for a different presidency before I come back.
Fair enough. If you could go back, is there something in the film that you would do differently, change? Is there something you left out that you would have put in?
I wouldn't put anything else in. I'd probably take something out. I can't remember what it was, but the last time I saw the film, I thought, should have left that out, really. I saw it about, I think it was March this year, just before Australia was affected by the COVID-19 crisis. And we had a big screening of about 150 people in an old church in Sydney. And it was a fantastic screening because the audience was so into the film. They were sort of like an older audience, people in their 50s plus. And it's probably a film that appeals to an older audience rather than a younger audience. But it was a fantastic audience, and the Q&A afterwards went on and on and on, and it was wonderful. I was watching the film at that time. I thought, I should have deleted that scene. It was too late then.
We all have those things we go back to that we wish we had or hadn't done, right?
Yeah. Well, the thing about making a film, it's particularly if you have a sort of a perfectionist trait, which I have, you can keep on working and working and working on it And there has to come a point where you just say, look, enough is enough, because we've got to get it finished. And, you know, you can just overwork things as well. But, you know, when you're making a film, I tend to be very fussy, and a second of a film is made up of 25 frames of picture. And so when I'm working with an editor, I say, I think there's about 3 or 4 frames that need to come off that shot. So it comes down to that level of detail and minutiae a lot of the time, if you're a fussy kind of filmmaker. So that's why the scene popping up, oh Jesus, I should have dropped that. Just surprised me, because I go through everything with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that story-wise it's right, the editing's right, the picture's right, etc.
We have a question from Karen. She says, in going back and forth between Philippe, the writing sleuth, on an antique typewriter in a film noir setting, to cartoon, to the near horror of his mom and family riding towards Auschwitz and suddenly rescued, to haunted eyes in his mom's early paintings, through to her obvious shining inner love of life, was it hard to thread the tones? And how well was the film received, and by what audiences?
Okay. Getting the balance right is difficult in any film. Doesn't matter what the components are, but your questioner is right in saying there were a lot of elements in the film. So making them all fit together, hopefully in a seamless kind of way. Yeah, I wouldn't say it was easy, but you know, we worked on it and we massaged it. I had a very good editor. My wife came to the screening that I just mentioned in the old church, and she looked at it again after, you know, several years and said, gee, it's an amazing film for the complexity of the elements, but how seamless it is. And she's a television producer who's a bit more sort of like makes shorter things, shorter documentaries than I do. So to have her say that's quite a compliment. I can't tell you about the process of doing it. It's trial and error most of the time. Does this work? Does it not work? Does the juxtaposition of that style or that scene with another style or scene that follows works? Does that work? It's just, I can only say it's trial and error, and you know when you've landed in the spot where you think it's working. And then you show it to people, and yes, some people say, oh, I'm not sure about that juxtaposition. And others will say, it's all great. So, and you've got to balance all those things up too, criticism and enjoyment. So I hope I've answered that part of the question. The film was very well received. It went to the Berlin Film Festival. And Philippe and I went to the screenings at the Berlin Film Festival. We're absolutely paranoid about showing a funny film about the Holocaust in Germany and how it would be received. We were just sort of like beside ourselves. Germans laughed. They asked good questions. They took it all seriously, but they enjoyed the film, just like other audiences. And our worry, our concern, our paranoia was ill-placed, but, you know, nevertheless, we had it. Going to Berlin, the home of the Holocaust, the devastation of the Second World War, and showing a funny film, you know, did seem to us to be a bit tricky. But it's very well received. Yes, the Variety review was critical, but overall very positive, I thought. Certainly good PR for the film, the Variety review. It's been shown at many, many festivals around the world. I think about 50 to 60 festivals. It toured all around Australia, New Zealand, a lot of Jewish film festivals internationally have shown it. It had its world premiere at the Melbourne Film Festival, got wonderful reviews in Melbourne because that's the home of the Mora family. It's screened in prime time on French and German TV, the full feature-length version. It got very good reviews in France. In the communist press, it got very good reviews. Fantastic review. It's like, you know, a very educated, cine-literate review of the film. Yeah, it's sold around the world through various small TV networks. It hasn't landed a major TV sale in America, which I'm a little bit disappointed about, but that's life. It's a crowded market for documentaries, so a lot of competition out there. But I think it's done very well, and it's still being screened. That's what I think is worth. That the proof is in the pudding that you've just put it online, but there are lots of other places that are doing that, and I'm still doing Q&As for various festivals. We're now 4 years after its release, so that's a good sign.
Do you think that the farther away we get from the Holocaust and those years after the war, the easier, and I don't know if easier is the right word, but the more acceptable it is to sort of tell a story about the Holocaust with more humor? For example, Jojo Rabbit, I think there's a film called Hitler's Pink Rabbit or something that also may have some humor behind it. Do you think because we're, you know, 3 and 4 generations out that people are a little more accepting?
I think that's a good question, and I think the premise of the question is actually right. But I come back to the point I made earlier that I think if you're going to keep this story alive, and you know, in the core of my being, I think that's an important thing to do as a human being, as a storyteller, as a filmmaker. I think it's important that we don't forget what happened. But if you're going to do that, you need to find different ways of approaching stories. So I think as a storyteller, that's really my motivation. How can I keep this story alive, but do it in a different way so that it's got some freshness about it, so that it's not easy to turn off. I mean, I've seen many dozens, scores of films about the Holocaust, and a lot of them do fall into a very familiar kind of pattern. And so, as I said, we were very determined we were not going to do that. We were going to do something different. And I think that's important. That's a strong, important motivation for a storyteller to keep the story alive, but to do it in a fresh kind of way. And maybe the passing of time since the end of the war allows for that to happen.
And I think too, for people who program for film festivals, we don't want the festival itself to always be just Holocaust films. We also don't want it to always be films that are sad either. And so following up on Karen's question, she said that that she didn't feel like it was a story about the Holocaust, that it was actually a wonderful story of survival and ongoing joy of life. For that, it deserves much applause.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And of course, I think that's, you know, part of the motivation for making it, for Philippe, for myself. It was Mirka Mora's attitude to life, that she had survived, she'd escaped, and that there was a joie de vivre associated with her because of that. I'm sure it was a part of her personality before the war. She was just that kind of woman. But the experience of the war, the making of a new life for her, her husband and her family in a faraway place like Melbourne, Australia. As Philippe says, she wanted to leave Europe behind and go somewhere where she could just forget about it. And I think she tried to do that and make a new life, but the paintings bubble up these things that, as you find out in the film, are a very big part of her makeup, her life, her memory of escaping the camp, leaving the camp and seeing all of the children with their big eyes left behind. It's an indelible part of her makeup and her art. So, but then there's the other side to Mirka, which is, you know, the fun side, the crazy side, the zany side, the foodie side. Yeah, so as I said, all those things needed to be part of the film, and it needed to celebrate that too.
I was sad to read at the end, and I'm sorry if I ruin it for anybody, but that Philippe's parents were divorced.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think that's unfortunately kind of a common thing with people who've gone through such trauma.
Yep, yep. Look, they had a. I don't want to say too much, but they did have an open marriage up to a certain point, and then I think for one of them, the open marriage led to a more serious romance, and that sort of changed the dynamic of the open marriage, and that's where it sort of fell apart. So
okay, we'll move on from that. What's one thing that you want people to take away from watching this film? If there was just one thing that we could all take away as the audience, what would you want that to be?
That this story is real, it happened, and despite the devastation, you can go on to enjoy life and have a successful life and have a wonderful life, but you should never forget what happened. So it's a number of things there in that answer, but you know, they're all connected.
Is there any particular filmmaker that has influenced your work?
Lots of filmmakers. Italian filmmakers from the 50s and 60s, Fellini, Rossellini, Vittorio De Sica, Ingmar Bergman. You know, lots of old favourites that I like and go back to. But I watch a lot of Netflix as well now. So, I was watching a film last night that I just thought was a wonderful story, an American film, an American independent film. And, I get a lot of, I'm a regular film watcher, whether it's a film festival or going to the cinema. I still like going to the cinema. And cinemas have just started to open up in Sydney after being shut down because of COVID. So I'm, cautiously going back to the cinema now. And there's a season of Fellini films on at the moment because this is the 100th year of his birth. So it's a celebration of Fellini's cinema because it's the 100th anniversary. So I've seen I Vitelloni and Satyricon. I'm going to see Nights of Cabiria on Sunday, and I'm just enjoying going back and revisiting these Fellini films that I saw when I was like 17 or 18. And so, somewhere in the back of my brain, there's all these influences going on, but I just like the movies, whether it's a movie on TV or going to the cinema or a festival.
Do you have one film that's just your absolute favorite go-to all the time when you just need that pick-me-up?
Casablanca. Probably seen Casablanca at least 20 times. So, yeah, that's one film. But then, there's a few like Fellini's 8.5 I go back to quite a lot. La Strada, another Fellini film starring his wife, Giulietta Messina, is a beautiful film. I saw that recently as well. And yeah, look, there's a whole lot of stuff. It's a whole lot of documentaries too, like Philippe's Swastika. I think Swastika is a wonderful film. Umbrella, Can You Spare a Dime? Another wonderful film as well.
Is there any book that you wish you could make into a film?
Mm.
Even though I have
No,
very strong feelings about books being made into films, they're never as good in my opinion, but I want to know if you have a book that you think you would like to make into a
good
film.
question. No, I don't. I tend to read a lot of non-fiction. Um, no, there isn't. There isn't a book that I'd like to make into a film.
Okay, fair enough. I appreciate that because they're not usually as good as the book. But anyway, what are you working on? You said you were just finishing up a film. Is it something that you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. I've just finished, in the last month, a film that I've been shooting in Italy, in the northwest, just near Turin, a little town called Asti. It's about an inspirational chef, so it's another foodie film, but food's probably more important in this story. He's a chef that's devised a training program and created a hotel to be able to do it, to train people with Down syndrome to become chefs, waiters, hotel workers, so that they can have a professional life and interact with the general public and be part of the great Italian hospitality and food culture that we all know of. So it's a sort of very intimate story about the chef and the Down syndrome people he works with and trains in the kitchen, in the hotel, across all the areas of work that you would do in a hotel. And it's a truly unique thing that's happened in northern Italy, where these young people are trained, given all these opportunities, and then go off and work as chefs or hotel workers or work in pizza parlors, all sort of manner of jobs, all ranges of jobs, all to do with hospitality. And it's a story I love because it's so warm and affectionate and loving, and all the characters are absolutely great. And I've been shooting it for 3 years. It's an official co-production between Italy and Australia. So it'll be released in Italy next year, early next year in cinemas, and then it will be released in Australia at the Melbourne International Film Festival next August. So
That's
that's my,
amazing.
and food is a very big part of it. Delicious Italian food and wine.
So one of our missions at JCC Chicago, a huge part of what we do is inclusion. So I would like to invite you to share that film with us when it is available on the film festival circuit, because we have a great partnership with another agency called Keshet, and what they do is they help people with different abilities live in homes, get jobs, be out in the world with everyone else. So we would love to share that with Chicago.
Okay.
It sounds amazing.
I'll send you the trailer today, and you're welcome to put it up on your website if you wish to. It's very much a film about inclusion, but it's not the sort of film that waves a placard and says, this is about inclusion. It's a story. It's a story with amazing characters, and it's through the characters that you get involved in their lives, their dreams, their dramas, their hopes, their aspirations. And you kind of lead an audience to think, well, what they can achieve, what they have achieved, can be applied in all sorts of other circumstances. So it is a film about inclusion, but it's not the primary focus, if you know what I mean.
Well, we showed a film at our film festival proper. The name escapes me right now, but it was about an organization that started an indoor greenhouse kind of a thing, and everyone who works there is a person with different abilities, and they all have different jobs, and they're trained. And it was one of our, I would say, one of our most successful films we showed at the festival this year. So people in our community are very invested in including everyone. So I
Yeah,
appreciate it. I look forward to sharing that.
that's
Trevor,
great to hear.
this has been fantastic. I'm so lucky that I have the opportunity to meet people literally from all over the world.
It's good for me too.
Thank you. Thank you. So we wish you the best of luck. Thank you,
Thank
everyone,
you.
for joining us this evening. Please check jccchicago.org. We have a author discussion later in the week, and next week we have a couple of more filmmaker discussions and lots going on. So again, Trevor, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. Everyone, good night, be well, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.